The year was 1945. The war in Europe was over, but for Liesl Miller, the war had simply changed form. She was no longer a soldier in the Signals Corps. She was a prisoner of war, transported across the wide, churning ocean to the American Midwest. Camp Harmony lay outside the quiet, sun-baked town of Willow Creek, Kansas. It was a temporary holding site for a small group of captured German women, auxiliaries, nurses, and support staff. The air was dry and hot, and the ground was a constant shifting dust. Liesl was 22, but the hardships had etched lines around her eyes that belonged to a much older woman. She carried herself with a rigid straightness, an emotional shield against the humiliation of capture. She was brave, known for keeping her section's morale steady during the worst bombardments, and that strength traveled with her across the ocean. But strength was quickly mistaken for arrogance by some of her captors. The first man to greet her group at the fence line was Sergeant Miller, a stocky man with a permanent scowl and a habit of chewing tobacco. Miller looked Liesl up and down, his eyes lingering on her boots. They were cracked, the leather peeling from countless miles of walking and the constant damp of European trenches. The right sole was separating near the toe. "Look at you, Fraulein," Miller drawled, spitting near her feet. "Stood against the mightiest army in the world in those things? Looks like you surrendered before the shoe did." He let out a harsh, barking laugh that none of the other guards joined. Liesl felt the flush of shame, but she held her chin high. She did not lower her eyes. "Sir, I completed my duty until the order to surrender was given," she stated clearly, her English perfect, though heavily accented. Miller's face darkened. He hated her composure, her refusal to break. "You're all the same, arrogant, think you're better than the dirt on those sorry boots. Well, you're not. You're just another number now, Miller, a number in rags." He had stripped away her uniform's rank, her nation, and her cause, but by mocking her boots, he had tried to strip away her dignity, the very foundation she stood upon. Liesl knew he underestimated her. He saw a tired girl in failing clothes. He did not see the mind planning, the spirit refusing to bow, the strong heart beating beneath the threadbare tunic. Liesl was determined. She would use her strength not for conflict, but for quiet endurance. She would not give Sergeant Miller the satisfaction of seeing her falter. But every step she took on the hard, unyielding Kansas earth was a painful reminder of her failing boots and her present, miserable reality. The barracks at Camp Harmony were spare, dusty, and hot. The women were demoralized, often spending their days staring listlessly at the low ceiling or crying softly into their meager, worn blankets. Liesl, however, could not sit still. She was trained to organize, to find order in chaos, and she applied that same discipline to their tiny, hopeless world. She took charge of the daily chores, distributing water, mending the tattered clothes of the sick, and creating a rotation for sweeping the dust that endlessly drifted under the poorly fitted doors. She noticed the quiet ones, the girls who were breaking down. She would sit with them in the evenings, speaking not of the war but of small, simple things, the taste of a fresh apple, the smell of snow on pine needles, the color of the North Sea. Her strength became their anchor. This selfless effort, this quiet sacrifice cost her. She gave up her small allotment of soap to a girl with terrible rashes. She sacrificed sleep to mend. Sergeant Miller watched her. He saw her efforts, the way the other women instantly obeyed her when she spoke, but he interpreted it through the lens of his prejudice. "Little dictator," he muttered to his fellow guard, Corporal Jones. "Still ordering people around even here. Doesn't know when to quit." He couldn't grasp that she was simply trying to survive by helping others survive. Liesl's own physical condition was deteriorating because of her sacrifice and her footwear. Her boots were now a true hazard. Every morning, she used a tiny piece of string to try and hold the flapping right sole in place. Blisters had turned to raw, painful patches on her heels. The boots, once protectors, were now instruments of slow torture. But she still walked in them, enduring the quiet pain. One afternoon, Liesl was outside the barracks, scraping mud from a bucket used for washing floors. She paused, flexing her toes to ease the deep ache. She did not know that she was being observed from the distance. In the shade of a dusty cottonwood tree outside the perimeter fence sat an old sedan. Inside, a woman in a simple floral dress watched the camp. She was Mrs. Eleanor Vance, a retired schoolteacher and a volunteer from the Willow Creek community. She came to the camp perimeter weekly, bringing donated books and often just sitting, watching the prisoners. Mrs. Vance didn't know the politics or the reasons for the war. All she saw through the shimmering heat was a group of girls, not enemies, but women the same age as her own daughter. And she saw Liesl, straight-backed, busy, and clearly suffering. Mrs. Vance's kind eyes fixed on the ragged, broken state of Liesl's boots, caked in dust and barely holding together. "They cannot even stand properly," she whispered to herself, a great maternal sadness welling up inside her. A body cannot heal if it is not supported. It was a simple, undeniable truth, crossing the divide of nations and war. Mrs. Vance decided then and there that something small, something utterly human, had to be done. The Kansas summer intensified, baking the dust into a hard, unforgiving crust. The work details became harder, moving stones, clearing brush, and other heavy, pointless tasks designed to wear out the prisoners. Liesl's strength, which had sustained her through so much, was finally being undermined by the small, everyday cruelty of her failing footwear. The blisters on her feet were constant companions. She stopped sleeping soundly, often jolting awake when she accidentally pressed her weight onto a tender heel. One sweltering morning, the women were tasked with hauling heavy wooden crates filled with old medical supplies from a storage tent across a short stretch of gravel. Liesl naturally took the heaviest crate. Sergeant Miller stood nearby, supervising the work with his usual bored hostility. He watched Liesl straining, the heavy crate digging into her hands. As she took a step, a sharp, grinding sound cut through the quiet air. The remaining threads holding the thick sole of her right boot finally gave way. The sole flopped loose, like a broken tongue, forcing her to stumble violently under the weight of the box. Liesl cried out, a short, sharp sound of pain and frustration. She didn't fall, but she had to drop the crate awkwardly, nearly twisting her ankle. Miller approached slowly, a cruel smile touching the edges of his mouth. "Watch your step, Miller," he said, not with concern, but with cold sarcasm. He jabbed the boot with the toe of his own polished military leather. "Looks like you've reached the end of the line. Just like your whole outfit." "I am still working, Sergeant," Liesl managed, her breath ragged, trying to quickly push the sole back into place. "You're slowing the work," he countered. "Can't you find a decent pair of boots in that pathetic pile of junk you call a barracks?" "Guess not. Too busy pretending to be in charge, maybe." He assigned the box to another weaker girl and sent Liesl back to the barracks, not for rest, but to sit and watch the others work. It was the deepest humiliation. To be deemed useless because of a broken piece of leather. The injustice burned through Liesl, not the capture, but the simple, careless disregard for human need. A pair of usable shoes was not a luxury. It was the basic requirement for movement and safety. Miller had seen her pain and had layered scorn upon it. Unbeknownst to Liesl, Mrs. Vance was driving past the camp at that very moment. She saw the women struggling with the crates, the heat shimmering off the gravel. She witnessed the precise moment Liesl stumbled and the terrible broken flopping of the old boot. She did not hear Miller's words, but she saw his dismissive, sneering gesture. In that fleeting, painful second, Mrs. Vance saw not an enemy, but the image of a child on her hands and knees in the dirt, betrayed by her own clothing, mocked by a callous man. The war had created a divide, but simple human suffering was universal. Mrs. Vance drove back to Willow Creek, her mind set. She knew a few kind words would not help. Action was required, an action that proved that even in wartime, basic decency remained. The next morning broke just like any other, dusty, hot, and heavy with the promise of tedious, aching work. Liesl sat on her cot, painfully wrapping the sole of her broken right boot with strips of cloth torn from an old rag, knowing it wouldn't last the hour. The other women were silent, sharing her quiet despair. Then, a strange sound broke the monotony. The loud, sputtering rumble of a civilian truck. Not the usual military vehicles. Sergeant Miller was immediately agitated. Who authorized this? "Back away from the fence!" he shouted, marching toward the gate. A moment later, a small convoy entered the camp, the old sedan belonging to Mrs. Vance, followed by a battered pickup truck driven by a solemn-looking farmer. The back of the truck was piled high with plain, unmarked cardboard boxes. Miller met Mrs. Vance aggressively at the guard shack. Liesl, watching through the tiny barrack window, could see the old woman standing firm, her hands clasped calmly in front of her floral dress. "These are private donations." "Sergeant," Mrs. Vance said, her voice clear and strong, "from the Willow Creek community. For the female prisoners. Basic necessities," Miller sputtered. "I can't allow that. They're enemy combatants, not charity cases." "They are women, Sergeant," Mrs. Vance replied simply, meeting his angry glare without flinching. "And they are shoeless. It's not a military risk. It's an act of human decency, and the camp commander approved it last night." She had worked late, calling in a favor from the base chaplain. Defeated, Miller gestured angrily to the farmer, allowing the boxes to be dropped near the barracks. The American guards, visibly confused, began the distribution. They called the German women forward, one by one. Liesl watched as the first few women, nervous and suspicious, were handed a heavy, plain box. They opened them slowly. A gasp went through the barracks. Not the weak, thin military issue they expected, but new shoes. Simple, sturdy, brown leather Oxfords, designed for walking and utility, and beside them a roll of thick, soft, gray wool socks. Brand new. When Liesl's name was called, she walked forward on her failing boots, the sole flopping with every step. Her face was a mask of disbelief. She took the box, the weight of it comforting and alien. Miller stood right beside her. "Don't get any ideas, Miller. It's just leather. Don't think it means anything." Liesl ignored him. She sat on the step, tore open the box, and reached inside. She pulled out the soft, thick socks, rubbing the wool against her cheek for a split second before pulling them over her blistered, tender feet. Then she slid her feet into the new Oxfords. The fit was perfect, solid, supportive. The simple, clean leather felt like a promise. For the first time in months, Liesl felt her feet completely secure. The pain vanished, replaced by a dull, miraculous relief. It wasn't just a shoe. It was an acknowledgement that she was worth supporting. It was a gift of dignity from strangers. Liesl looked up, across the fence line, searching. She saw Mrs. Vance giving a small, almost imperceptible nod. In that moment, the power of Sergeant Miller's scorn was utterly broken by the simple, profound kindness of the people of Willow Creek. Liesl stood up straight, testing the solid ground beneath her new, unwavering foundation. The new shoes changed everything, not just for Liesl, but for all the women. The transformation was immediate and profound. They no longer shuffled. They walked with purpose. The constant, low-level pain that had drained their energy was gone, replaced by a resilience that glowed in their faces. Liesl, now walking securely and without pain, found her mind sharper, too. With her physical burden lifted, her leadership reasserted itself effortlessly. She organized the barracks better, found ways to improve the meager daily exercise, and even managed to secure permission from a less cynical guard to start a small, neat garden for the camp kitchen, arguing it would save the American budget. Sergeant Miller, however, was furious. The gift was an unspoken rebuke to his own cruel behavior, a direct message that others valued the prisoner's humanity more than he did. He tried to undermine the goodwill, attempting to confiscate the shoes under the pretense of inspection, but was stopped by a stern warning from his commanding officer, who had appreciated the positive press the donation had generated in the local newspaper. Liesl, inspecting her new shoe one evening, noticed something peculiar. Tucked tightly beneath the inner sole, almost impossible to see, was a thin strip of paper. It wasn't a message of escape or politics. It was a simple, handwritten note from Mrs. Vance. "Look up. Look around. The earth is the same everywhere." It was a philosophical, gentle reminder to observe, to be present, and to recognize the common ground. It was an instruction that Liesl took to heart. With her new, steady steps, she began to observe the camp in a different way. She moved silently, efficiently, paying attention to the routines of the guards, especially Miller. One evening, Liesel was returning to the barracks after checking the garden. She saw Sergeant Miller slipping something small and metallic out of the camp kitchen, which was clearly marked as a supply area. He looked around nervously, stashing the item quickly inside a small, worn pouch he kept beneath his belt. Liesel realized it was a small tin of coffee, an expensive ration meant for the entire camp's officers. It was a small theft, a minor corruption, but it spoke volumes about his character. Liesel had no evidence, only a momentary glance. But she knew that a man who mocked the suffering of broken souls would certainly steal the communal comforts of others. She had been insulted, underestimated, and now she had seen the true weakness of her tormentor. Liesel knew she finally had the footing, the literal and metaphorical, to seek not revenge, but justice. She would use the strength given to her by the kind people of Willow Creek to expose the rottenness of the one person who had tried to take her dignity. Liesel knew she could not speak directly to the camp commander. Miller would deny everything, and her word as an enemy prisoner meant nothing. She needed proof, or at least a trustworthy avenue. The note from Mrs. Vance, telling her to look around, gave her the courage to act. Liesel used the small, precious time she had working in the garden outside the kitchen. Over the next 3 days, while Miller was on duty, she carefully noted the precise daily inventory of certain desirable items, sugar, coffee, and powdered milk, using her excellent memory. She knew the official consumption rate. She knew the discrepancies were small but consistent. On the 4th day, Liesel took the biggest gamble of her captivity. She approached Corporal Jones, the guard who had seemed the most neutral and uncomfortable with Miller's bullying. Liesel found him at the fence during a quiet shift change. "Corporal Jones," Liesel said softly, standing tall in her new clean shoes. "I believe Sergeant Miller is taking supplies meant for the officers' mess. I have noted the daily inventory shortage of coffee and sugar. He keeps it in a small canvas pouch under his belt." Jones was taken aback, terrified of Miller, but he had seen Liesel's strength and felt the wrongness of Miller's actions. He saw the new, sturdy shoes Liesel was wearing, a symbol of the decency Miller had fought against, and felt a pang of moral clarity. He knew Liesel would not risk her life on a lie. Jones immediately reported the suspicion to the executive officer, citing the exact discrepancies Liesel had outlined. The officer, annoyed by Miller's constant complaints and poor conduct, ordered an immediate, quiet search. That evening, as Miller was about to leave the camp, he was stopped. The small canvas pouch was found, containing 3 small tins of high-quality coffee and several packets of sugar. The evidence was undeniable. Miller had been stealing from the U.S. Army. The exposure was quiet, a swift military investigation far from the public eye. Liesel was called in, not as a witness, but as a person providing information crucial to a security matter. She stood before the commander, her feet steady and firm in the new shoes, and explained, simply and factually, what she had seen and recorded. She did not express hatred or triumph. She only spoke the truth. Sergeant Miller was quickly reassigned and demoted, an official punishment for supply theft. Liesel never saw him again. The twist was not revenge, but the powerful satisfaction of justice achieved by dignity regained. The commander looked at Liesel not with the contempt of an officer viewing a prisoner, but with the dawning respect for a woman of courage and principle. Liesel walked back to the barracks that night, no longer feeling the shame of rags but the solid reality of her new footing. The true uniform of a soldier, she realized, was not the faded cloth of her homeland, nor the canvas of a prison camp. It was the unwavering knowledge of right and wrong, and the power to stand up for the truth. The shoes, a gift of mercy from strangers, had literally given her the ground she needed to fight for her own redemption. She was no longer Miller the captive. She was Liesel, the woman who had stood firm,